Center Street in New York City, and you can see who has gathered. There is a fleet of journalists from around the globe waiting on this. This park that you see, if we're able to show the park to the right there, this is the First Amendment zone that has been set up. Again, apologies with this as we try to pan over there, but this is the scene. It's relatively quiet. I wouldn't describe this as a extremely tense situation. I do wonder, this is being New York City after all, if we're going to see people come down from other parts of the city to be outside for this historic moment. We'll have to wait and see, but right now relatively calm. Journalists doing their job, all trying to get more information as we know it. Let's bring back in Michael Scotto if we can. We're so fortunate to have your legal expertise here of what is happening. What do you make of the fact that the judge kept everybody in the courthouse all day? Because I've covered trials where the criminal defendant was maybe able to stay at their hotel room or be at their home and then come to the court. It's clear that Judge Juan Merchan wants to get this verdict out.
Yes, and I think, judges always want the attorneys and the DA and the defendant available. In this case, it's much different because former President Trump has a security entourage that follows him. So that was probably one reason. But again, he didn't want to waste the jurors' time. And if there's a verdict, you're going to take the verdict. If there's readback, you want the jury to be able to get the readback. So I think, certainly that's consistent with the way he's run his courtroom.
If there is a guilty verdict, when would sentencing be taking place?
Well, in the first instance, there would have to be a probation report. The New York City Department of Probation, in every case in which somebody is convicted of a felony, must present the court with a report about the offender. In this case, that would be former President Trump if he's convicted, and it would talk about the nature of the offenses, his background, and they'd make a sentencing recommendation. That usually takes about 4 to 6 weeks, so that would be the earliest time that the case would be back in front of a judge for sentencing.
And we've just learned that Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, has entered the room. Is that expected in a high-profile case like this?
Yeah, in a high-profile case like this or any case that the DA is personally involved in, he will want to be there. Again, this prosecution was brought in the name of the people of the state of New York, but it was really brought by DA Bragg. He's the one that made the decision when DA Vance stepped back and didn't want to, leave this case as an indictment or an unindicted case.
But he wasn't the one asking all the questions every day.
No.
He was the public face.
He was the public face of the case. But again, it's not unusual for the elected district attorney to come to see the summations, the opening, some of the critical testimony, and certainly be on hand for the verdict.
And our correspondent Alex Miller, who's providing real-time information. Judge Juan Merchan has informed the jurors to return to the room. So we're getting close?
Yeah, I mean, it's once they're back in the courtroom, the verdict sheet will be given to the clerk. The court will take a look at it first, and then the court will ask the foreperson if they've reached a verdict. Yes, and then they'll go through each of those counts. Guilty
34 of them.
Absolutely, yes. And then at the end, either side has a chance to poll the jury, and that's for each of them individually to say what their vote is.
History upcoming here in Lower Manhattan with this verdict, guys, reverberating around the world.
Joe, thank you. Stick with us. Let's bring in our political director, Andrew Rafferty. Andrew, the judge, as Joe said, has told jurors to return to the courtroom. Andrew, are all the TVs in Washington tuned into what's happening right now?
In Washington, yes, and in places like Detroit, Madison, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Maricopa County, all those other key places that we're talking about and what amounts to who essentially becomes the next president, well, I think a lot of people are paying attention. They may not have been paying attention to the ins and the outs of this trial, but they certainly are paying attention to what's going on right now. And it goes to a larger point, that is that what we've seen over the past 5 weeks has essentially sucked up the entire oxygen of the campaign. And we've talked about the polls and that a lot of people say what happens ultimately in a few moments when we get this verdict won't impact how they decide how they're choosing in November. Well, the problem is breaking through for Joe Biden right now.
And we're just getting some updates right now from Alex Miller, who is in our courtroom. I'm just going to read them off as I get them here. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Count 5, guilty. Count 6, guilty. Count 7, guilty. Count 8, guilty. Count 9, guilty. Count 10, guilty. Count 11, guilty. Count 12, guilty. Count 13, guilty. Count 14, guilty. Waiting on count 15 coming in. Count 15, guilty. Alex writes that former President Trump totally stone-faced. Count 16, guilty. Count 17, guilty. Count 18, guilty. Count 19, guilty. Count 20, guilty. Count 21, guilty. Count 22, guilty. Count 23, guilty. 24, guilty. 25, guilty. 26, guilty. 27, guilty. 28, guilty. 29, guilty. 30, guilty. 31, guilty. 32, guilty. 33, guilty. And count 34, guilty. Former President Donald Trump found guilty by this jury on all 34 counts. Found guilty, according to national political correspondent Alex Miller, inside the courtroom, saying the former president briefly looked at the jury, but he is, as she describes, stone-faced. You can take a look here, some live pictures outside coming in, as now that we have this historic verdict in.
And a combination of what we're hearing is cheers outside the courtroom, but also these images on screen right now showing some of the frustration from supporters of the former president. And of course, you know, we'll be trying to make sure that, you know, the language is
right. Tensions, as you can see, certainly flaring up as this come in. Let's go back to Deputy Political Director Joe St. George. Joe, 34 counts. Former President Trump guilty.
Former President Trump is a convicted felon, and it is a powerful moment. It is a historic moment. Never before in the history of this republic has an American president, a former president, been convicted of a crime. That has all changed just after 5 o'clock Eastern time in Lower Manhattan. It is history, and it's unfolded before us in the last few moments. I think the impact of this verdict from a political standpoint, though, is very much to be determined. You have many Republicans who believe that these charges should never have been brought. They have believed every word of former President Trump over the last several years, that this has been a witch hunt. I'm hearing the cheers that perhaps you've been picking up on as we're continuing these live pictures here in New York. There are people celebrating this. There are critics of the former president who are saying right now, finally, Mr. Trump is labeled a convicted felon. How it plays out among independent voters, well, there's a second jury, as we've been noting over the course of the last several days, the jury of the American people. They'll render their verdict on Mr. Trump on Election Day in November. But let's bring back in Michael Scotto. Guilty, all counts. Reaction.
Well, you know, he was going to be guilty or not guilty of all counts because it's basically the same scheme. So, again, I think the jury went back to that initial meeting and they believed that it was an unlawful conspiracy, and then they just needed to hear the judge's charge, and they discussed it and they came to the verdict. So, you know, at the core, it was a simple case if they believed everything.
Could he go to jail now?
It's not likely that he'd be put into custody today. Ultimately, it's up to the judge to decide when he's sentenced, and he could be sentenced to a jail sentence.
Mr. Trump hasn't said anything yet, but I suspect that they're going to try to appeal this.
Yeah.
What does that process look like here in New York?
Okay, so in New York, basically, every defendant in a criminal case, if they're convicted, has 30 days to file a notice of appeal. It's a piece of paper. I mean, that'll happen in short order. And then depending on whether they're out on bail or whether or not they're sentenced, and they can only actually perfect the appeal after he's convicted and sentenced. So it's going to take a little while. But basically, he gets to appeal as a matter of right to the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court, which is up on Madison Avenue and 23rd Street, not too far from this court. And that's where he'll make his arguments about the legal arguments, whether this was really an appropriate use of the charges, and also, whether the jury's verdict was consistent with what that evidence was.
How big of a victory is this for the Manhattan District Attorney? Because there have been a lot of attorneys, and I'm looking at you too, who said that this wasn't a slam dunk case. District Attorney Alvin Bragg took a risk indicting a former president, and on this day, he was able to get a guilty verdict.
Yes, it was not a slam dunk, and it was through the work of the prosecutors assigned to the case, and it was, the investigative team that they were able to do this. But yes, credit to D.A. Bragg, because again, this is a case that D.A. Vance decided to leave for D.A. Bragg as sort of like a parting gift when he left office. And so D.A. Bragg had to reassess the case, and obviously there was some contention about that. I recall Congress even getting involved. But I think it's a credit to him that the case was brought and that the jury has returned that guilty verdict.
Mr. Trump is not a typical criminal defendant.
No.
But if you were in there representing your average Joe criminal defendant and a guilty verdict was just read, what would typically someone who was just found guilty of 34 felonies have to do next?
Well, again, typically this is a non-violent case. It's an E felony, the lowest felony. There's no mandatory jail. He has ties to the community. We know where he's going to be. Anybody like that would not be, immediately put into custody or have their bail or their recognizance revoked. So it's not different in that way. But again, if he is going to be sentenced and there's a jail sentence, obviously it's going to be much different because he is a former president.
And how typically, we're waiting for more information, but when would a sentencing hearing typically take place?
I would imagine it would take the probation department 4 to 6 weeks to prepare their report, and that's when the judge would schedule the case for sentencing. Mr. Trump's legal team, in the meantime, could file a motion to set aside the verdict. You can do that with this judge, even before he's sentenced, and then that would be litigated. But it's, if anybody's thinking he's going straight off to jail or it's going to happen anytime soon, I would say that, that's probably the wrong view.
And that is the legal side of this. Guys, there's a whole other prism to view this through, and that's through the political sphere. Mr. Trump is ahead, it seems, in almost every consequential swing state, at least in most polls. We'll see if there's any impact politically after this shocking flash development. Again, for the first time in American history, we have a former American president who's been convicted of a crime, guys.
And moments ago, Judge Juan Merchan thanking the jurors for their service. We want to bring in Mitchell Ebner. He's a former federal prosecutor and lawyer. Mitchell, again, guilty on all 34 counts. Give us your reaction to this historic event.
Well, you said it right there. This is historic. This is as your correspondent was saying, this is the first time a former American president has been found guilty of any crime. For him to be found guilty of 34 separate felonies is astounding. When this indictment was announced, many people thought, and many public commentators stated that they thought that this was the least serious of the 4 potential cases, but this is the one that went to trial first. And whatever else Donald Trump is for the rest of his life, he will always be a convicted felon.
How do you expect the sentencing process to work from here?
I'm glad you asked that question, Chris. So what will happen now is the probation department will work up a report, and after that there will be a sentencing proceeding. Under New York law, because this is an E felony and he's a first-time offender, the range is stated to be 1 1/3 to 4 years, and that's true even though there are 34 counts. They don't stack on top of each other, but the court has the discretion to impose 0 jail time and go with straight probation or something else. So it is really completely in the hands of Justice Juan Merchan, and one might wonder whether former President Donald Trump is going to regret the day or days or months that he's been attacking in the most personal terms the man who now holds Donald Trump's liberty in his hands.
Because Juan Merchan, it is solely on him to do the sentence. That was one of the instructions that he gave the jury. And of course, we've heard the former president each day before and after court. That was really the main person that he had been very critical of.
Well, yes, he has been very critical of Justice Juan Merchan. He's been critical of the DA, Alvin Bragg. He also went after Justice Merchan's daughter. So if it were possible to enrage a judge to the max, I think that former President Trump has done it.
And earlier this week, the former president addressed reporters outside the courtroom before deliberations began. And in keeping with what we've seen over the past month, he referred to the trial as being rigged. He slammed the judge, Juan Merchan, overseeing the case, calling him corrupt. He said, quote, Mother Teresa could not beat these charges. He also called the trial a very disgraceful situation and shared his frustration that he has not been able to campaign for office because of it. Again, those were the comments that he made before deliberations, and very curious to see how he responds today.
And Mitchell, we know Donald Trump, throughout his career when it comes to court cases, he is very good at delaying things. We've seen that play out. Through the appeal process, is there a way for him to delay the sentencing?
Well, the sentence will be announced and there'll be an order. The question will be whether the Justice Merchan agrees to stay in position of the sentence pending appeal. That's, of course, going to depend on what sentence is imposed. There would be much more reason to stay an incarcerative, a jail sentence, than there would be to stay, for example, a probationary sentence or a fine, because probation is not particularly onerous and a fine could be refunded. But I don't know what Justice Merchan is going to do with regard to granting bail pending appeal. And if he chooses not to grant bail pending appeal, then former President Trump could ask the appellate division to issue bail. But that's a hard sell. Once the judge makes a decision, the decision is really entrusted to the discretion of the trial judge. As I said before, the choice to go after Justice Merchan in the most personal terms possible is something that I wonder if Donald Trump will come to regret.
All right, Mitchell Epner, former federal prosecutor, thank you for taking the time. You're taking a live look here. This is outside of the courthouse. You can see some members of former President Trump's team gathered there. Alina Habba, one of his attorneys in his other cases, standing outside of the courtroom. National political correspondent Alex Miller was in the courtroom as this verdict was read. She said that Trump, former president, was very stone-faced, and there he is right there. We just learned that sentencing will be held on July 11th. The former president making his way right now. Todd Blanche, his defense attorney, standing right next to him. This is typically where the former president makes a comment. Let's hear what he has to say live.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA. And the whole thing, we didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
Are you going to drop out?
All right, former President Donald Trump saying, quote, this was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial. They wouldn't give us a venue change. He then said this was a rigged, disgraceful trial. So the former president repeating himself a few times, but maintaining his innocence throughout his response to the verdict. Let's bring in our co-anchor, Christian Bryant. He's live in Washington tonight for more details on the sentencing date that has been set. Christian.
Chris, one of the things that we have been talking about as this news has been developing is a timeline. And now we understand that a sentencing date has been set. This is from the Associated Press. Judge Juan Merchan has set Donald Trump's sentencing for July 11th, just days before Republicans are set to select him as 2024 nominee. So as we are learning more about this historic case and how the jury has decided this case, we now know that the sentencing for July 11th is, a little more than a month away. One of the questions that we will have to answer, and one of the things that we'll be looking for, is exactly how this verdict will impact the former president's chances at becoming the next president. So this is something that we will continue to follow, the timeline for all of this. Again, the sentencing is July 11th, just days before Republicans are set to select him as the 2024 nominee. Chris.
Yeah, the former president saying, though, that the real sentencing date will be on Election Day this fall.
Really maintaining what was kind of his theme throughout the entire trial. I also noted, just thinking of what Mitchell Epner, former federal prosecutor, was talking about, where Judge Merchan is the person who's going to be making the sentence for former President Trump, and he started out once again calling him corrupt in the statement you just heard there from the former president. Let's get to White House correspondent Haley Bull live in Washington. Haley, any reaction from the White House on this verdict?
Oh, Chris, we are waiting here at the White House to see how and if President Biden responds to this verdict. The president spending the day in Delaware, as today marks the 9th anniversary of his son, Beau Biden's death. But how he responds, if he moves forward in doing so, will be a critical moment for him, bringing together a cross-section of both his role as the leader of the United States, but also a candidate seeking re-election on the campaign trail. The White House has been loath to talk about Trump's legal issues, specifically in anticipation of this verdict, reiterating that Biden is focused on the job at hand, really being careful to maintain a degree of separation from it, as they have with the multiple cases the former president faces, which is notable as Trump, as you just heard, has sought to put the onus on Biden and paint the picture that this is politically motivated. But the question now is how much Biden leans into this verdict from this point on, whether he continues to portray a magnitude of distance from it, that same message that he is focused on his agenda and his messaging, or whether he embraces this and uses that further on the campaign trail. Biden on the campaign trail, we have seen taking the gloves off and attacking Trump on policy, on his rhetoric, on January 6th most recently, but has largely stopped short of wading in to any of the legal cases. But the campaign has certainly set up the dueling images we have seen in recent weeks of Biden on the campaign trail, holding events, rallies, remarks, as Trump's campaign was centered around the courthouse. You saw earlier this week the campaign holding a press conference in New York on January 6th with officials and actor Robert De Niro earlier this week. One of the additional questions that we will be seeing going forward is how this impacts those moderate, undecided voters that each side is so carefully trying to peel away, Chris.
Haley, we know it's hard to predict, but has the administration given any indication as to whether or not we'll actually hear from President Biden tonight?
No, there's not been an indication whether we will hear from him. In many cases, this comes down to what the president decides to do, whether this comes in a statement, whether we hear him speak, whether he says nothing at all. That remains to be seen. But it is noteworthy, Chris, I want to add, as we look ahead to the sentencing date, you were just talking about July 11th. That will come at the same time as the NATO Leaders Summit here in Washington, D.C., which for the president will set up another split-screen moment here.
All right, White House correspondent Haley Wolf for us live in front of the White House. Haley, thank you. Let's bring in political director Andrew Rafferty right now. You heard Haley talking about the sentencing date and a NATO summit that'll be happening around that time. But also, it's notable that this sentencing date is right before the RNC in Milwaukee.
Yeah, well, guys, we talked about if you have to be a presidential candidate going through a criminal trial, this date is actually not a bad one. You got through the primaries. The spring is generally a sleepier time, but this date for sentencing is really interesting for some of those reasons that you guys just laid out. July 11th, if that's the sentencing, well, it's July 15th that the RNC formally begins in Milwaukee. And oh, by the way, a couple weeks before that, we are going to have our first debate. So you're going to have a debate between the sitting president, his top rival, who, oh, by the way, just happened to be convicted on 34 counts and is now a convicted felon. I'm sure he's going to appeal, as we heard, but the facts of what we just learned today very much will still stand. So you take all those together. Also worth noting, of course, Donald Trump is a resident of Florida. If you're a felon, you cannot vote. There are ways to restore that, specifically if you have a felony that is a nonviolent offense. But for now, it seems that Donald Trump won't even be able to vote in his home state. So there are just a lot of layers to this stuff that Democrats, not necessarily the president himself, but certainly his allies on the campaign trail, will most certainly be picking up on in the next few weeks, because now that this trial is behind us, things get really, really interesting for how the public reacts to what this could impact who ultimately wins the White House this fall.
And Andrew, before you go, just a hypothetical question here. If the former president were sent to jail, does the RNC have any backup rules in place, for another candidate?
Yeah, it's interesting because they have been so averse, certainly publicly, of talking about that, because this is a party, we know the new leadership, Laura Trump is one of them. They're very much on Donald Trump's side. So that really hasn't even been a situation that they have entertained up to this point. But you're right, if that could potentially be quite an interesting and unprecedented scenario.
And Andrew, what have you heard about the Trump campaign and preparing for this moment that he would be found guilty?
I think they prepared in the way that they have in the lead up to this, saying this is a witch hunt. They have their allies out there. They are in New York right now, and they have been able to use this as much as anyone could to a political advantage. We saw it in the primaries. This is a different electorate, though. This is the general electorate, and how people react to being indicted, charged, tried, convicted is going to be very different.
All right, Andrew Rafferty, thank you. Stick with us. All right, for those of you leaving us, your local programming is coming up next. But for those of you staying with us, we'll, of course, continue our special coverage of this verdict. Former President Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony charges. Again, a jury of 12 charged with determining the former president's guilt. We know 7 men and 5 women were on that panel. This alleged hush money scheme to silence adult film star Stormy Daniels. Former President Donald Trump convicted on all 34 counts this afternoon.
And if you're just joining us right now, you're watching special coverage, a verdict in former President Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial, guilty on all 34 counts. You're taking a live look outside of the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, where you can see some supporters from this angle of the former president standing. We have also seen those who have been critical of the former president standing outside as well today, as well as dozens of members of the media. Very historic moment coming down.
Let's head out to national political correspondent Alex Miller. Alex was inside the courtroom all day and joins us with the latest developments. Alex.
Well, hello there. This was a whirlwind of
not even an hour. We thought that the jury was going to be dismissed. The judge came in a little after 4 o'clock and said that he was going to dismiss the jury for the day. And then there was kind of a lull. Everybody was in the courtroom wondering what exactly was going on, because he had said he was going to bring the jury in to dismiss them, and nothing happened. And then very close to 4:30 p.m., around 4:20, he walked back in and said that there was a note from the jury saying that they had reached a verdict and they wanted to know if there was time for them to fill out all of the necessary forms. Remember, there are 34 counts here. So this took quite a bit of time. Just after 5 p.m., the judge came back in, repeated this jury note, asked if it was okay on both sides to bring the jury in. They obviously said yes, brought the jury in, and the foreman read all 34 counts. At the very beginning, the screens around the area were off so that we couldn't see the former president's face until just as they were reading the verdicts, all 34 counts. He briefly looked to the side at the jurors for just a little bit of time, completely stone-faced, turning back to face, I guess technically the judge. It wasn't clear exactly what he was looking at as the rest of the verdict was read. Guilty on all 34 counts. Not even 2 days of deliberation when you think about it. They came back, spent basically the entire first part of the morning hearing back testimony, wanting to hear the jury instructions again. They read about half of the jury instructions over. Then they went and read the testimony again relating to David Pecker's testimony, a phone call between Pecker and Donald Trump. They wanted to hear the testimony about that now infamous August 2015 meeting at Trump Tower where David Pecker offered to be the eyes and the ears. This really seemed to be the holdup here for these jurors. They worked, as far as we know, through lunch today. We couldn't hear much inside the courtroom. Some people were able to hear a little bit of chanting outside, but we were locked inside of this courtroom. By the way, the internet was going in and out as this was all happening, so it was an incredibly frantic situation for everybody in the room to try to be able to bring everybody the information as we got it. After the right before the jury was excused, the judge told him that he wanted to meet with them in his chambers as they were excused. He wanted to thank them personally for what he did. He thanked them before the courtroom, thanked the alternates, noting that this really was a long trial. It's been some 6 weeks that they have been going through this. We were into the 7th week when you include the picking of the jury here. And so that is a long time for somebody to give up. And so he said he was going to speak with them, but he made very clear to say that he will not discuss the case, not discuss any of the facts of the case, just that he wanted to thank them. And he also wanted their feedback. He wanted to hear what went well, what didn't go well, and how they could improve the jury system in the future. After he left, or after the jury left, rather, Todd Blanche filed a motion to essentially dismiss this case on the grounds of Michael Cohen's testimony. He said in part that no jury could have made this decision with Michael Cohen's testimony. There's no way the court could allow the verdict knowing Cohen lied on the stand. That's what the defense is contending right now, that Michael Cohen perjured himself on the stand. To be clear, that has not been corroborated by the judge, by the district attorney's office. They contest that. And so the judge denied that motion, setting the sentencing for July 11th at 10 a.m. Todd Blanche saying because they frankly have a lot of work to do in his documents case down in Florida, that he's going to have to be down in Florida for quite some time, to be in a skiff in a special room to go through some of this classified material. And so they wanted to see this, the sentencing to be in the middle of July. That fits with what the DA typically does. By the way, Alvin Bragg was in the room, the district attorney, the entire time. He made no, as far as we could tell, emotional we couldn't see anything on his face as he was as the verdict was being delivered, but even after the Trump team cleared the courtroom, we weren't sure if he was going to celebrate a little bit with his colleagues, and he did not. He left immediately. Then the rest of the prosecutors were there to pack up everything, and then they exited decently quickly as well. Eric Trump was in the room for this verdict, by the way, and as Donald Trump walked down the aisle after this verdict, he shook his hand. Trump looking a little bit redder, I think, in his face than he typically does when we see him walk into the room. But everybody on that side of the courtroom definitely had a very straight face as they exited.
And really quickly, Alex, as you said, we know members of the former president's family have been rotating through the courtroom to show their support for Donald Trump. What was Eric Trump's reaction?
He sat completely stone-faced as the entire verdict was read. He did not move, at least from when I was glancing at him in between writing down the verdict. He did not move a muscle. He stayed completely straight, looking straight ahead with really no look in his face at all.
Alex, thank you.
National political correspondent Alex Miller, stay close. You can see we have team coverage right now covering this story from all angles. I want to bring in legal affairs correspondent Ava Joy Burnett, because for those who are just joining us right now, we know that there has been this guilty verdict. The question is, what happens next? What will be the process as we go here to this July 11th sentencing date?
Yeah, well, that is going to be a very significant date, July 11th, when we have sentencing. But there are a few things that need to happen before we have this actual sentencing from the judge. There's this thing known as a pre-sentencing report. This is where there's a certain division of the New York City government where they pretty much look at all of the background of this defendant, the former president who is now convicted, and they get an idea of what the potential sentence should be. Then they send this information over to Judge Juan Merchan. This will just be a recommendation on what they believe the sentence for this particular defendant could be. Remember, for these charges, there are 34 counts here. He was found guilty on all of them. And for each count, there is a possibility. It's a little bit odd, but it's 1 1/3 of a year. That's the floor. And then we could go all the way up to 4 years. So that is the sentencing range for each count. But then there's also the possibility that the former president, whatever the sentence is, those could run together. And so it could be concurrent. So there isn't going to be a scenario, most likely, where if he gets a year and 1/3, for example, where it's a year and 1/3 times 34. If he even gets any jail time, it's likely that the judge here will have it run concurrent. And he does not have to have jail time. There are a few things, there are a few possibilities of what could happen. There could be a fine here, especially because a former president has not been convicted. He does not have a record here. So that's what needs to happen before we actually have the sentencing that is done on July 11th. There's also the possibility that the attorneys for the former president can ask the judge, Judge Juan Merchan, to hold off on everything while they appeal. That is something that is totally different. There's an intermediary court in the state of New York that could look at this matter. According to legal experts who have spoken with, they could have about 30 days to request or notify the court that they want to appeal this actual decision. And then they have about 6 months, according to officials I've spoken with, to actually file this appeal. So there's a notification that they want to appeal this decision. And then there is the actual submission of the documents that says they want to appeal this. So those are all the steps that we have to go through. So even though we have this July 11th date on the calendar, there are a lot of things that could shift between now and then.
And Ava Joy, moments ago, we heard from the former president. He said that our country's gone to hell. Those were his words, not mine. He really laid into the Biden administration and blamed Joe Biden for this verdict, Ava Joy.
Yeah, and you know, what's very interesting about all of this, it appears as if the former president was preparing the country for what could potentially be a guilty verdict. Even when he quoted people who thought this case should not have been brought in the first place, yesterday when he spoke with the media, even though it was brief, he was preparing them for what could potentially be a guilty verdict. That's when he made that Mother Teresa reference, and then he said, but who knows, we will see. Earlier today, Alina Habba, the attorney who represented him in another New York trial, she also said it was a good sign that the jury was asking questions, but she also said there's this other step of appealing. So it really appeared as if they were preparing for this moment, and now we have a guilty verdict on all 34 counts against the former president.
All right, legal affairs correspondent Ava Joy Burnett, thank you. Let's bring in anchor Christian Bryant right now. We saw the former president, Christian. He was very swift in coming out and making remarks, and we're also seeing a lot of reaction on social media from GOP lawmakers.
Yeah, the former president isn't the only person that has a lot to say here. I want to go back to something that our deputy political director, Joe St. George, said. We're hearing from two different juries right after this verdict has been reached. There were the 12 that we heard from, and then there's the court of public opinion. And we're already starting to hear from people who are close to the former president. Let's start with Michael Cohen, the former president's former fixer and also one of the star witnesses. He tweeted, guilty on all counts, along with the screenshot from MSNBC showing the 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. We also are hearing from Donald Trump Jr. One of the things that we were talking about a second ago was reaction from the former president's children. Well, Donald Trump Jr. posted this on X as well. Guilty on all counts. The Democrats have succeeded in their years-long attempt to turn America into a third world S-hole, is what he said. November 5th is our last chance to save it. And the former president said November 5th is when the real verdict will be read out. We also heard from DA Alvin Bragg. He said on X, a very short post here today, a jury found Donald J. Trump guilty on all 34 counts. There's one more that I want to read for our audience here. This is from Speaker Mike Johnson. He had a lengthy statement on X saying, today is a shameful day in American history. Democrats cheered as they convicted the leader of the opposing party on ridiculous charges predicated on the testimony of a disbarred convicted felon. This was a purely political exercise, not a legal one. The weaponization of our justice system has been a hallmark of the Biden administration, and the decision today is further evidence that Democrats will stop at nothing to silence dissent and crush their political opponents. The American people see this as lawfare, and they know it is wrong and dangerous. President Trump will rightfully appeal this absurd verdict, and he will win. Again, as Joe St. George said a bit earlier, two different juries. We heard from the one in the courtroom, and now we're hearing from the folks, the court of public opinion, if you will. And I'm sure that we'll continue to hear more as the day goes on, folks.
Yeah, we're also now hearing from the former president's campaign team. They're sending out fundraising emails in response to this verdict. Christian, thank you. I want to bring in now former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Marie Pereira. She is with us. Marie, give us your take on this historic verdict.
I'm stunned. I didn't think that the jurors would wrap their heads around the convoluted nature of the charges. I didn't think, even given all the facts proven, that the jurors would find that there was a crime committed. I thought it would be jury nullification. I am shocked that they found him guilty because, again, the way the case was put together, the elements of the crime, just the fact that he's found guilty because, to me, it was political strategy. He didn't want the people to know about his dirty deeds with Stormy. So there was an NDA signed and people were paid off. I didn't think the jury would agree that in and of itself he had the intent to commit election fraud based on the background of how this money was paid out. I'm shocked.
And just learned that Alvin Bragg, Manhattan District Attorney, will be having a news conference at 6:30, so about 45 minutes from now, as you take on one side of your screen a live look there outside of the courthouse in Manhattan. Marie, and there you see former President Trump actually leaving the courthouse right now, heading to his motorcade. He will be sentenced on July 11th. We heard him after the sentencing when he walked out of the courtroom, continued to be critical, to say the least, of Juan Merchan, the judge who now holds the power of what the sentence will be for the former president. Former President Trump has been extremely critical of Merchan. He's been critical of Merchan's daughter on social media and news conferences, the whole deal. How much could that impact what Judge Merchan decides Donald Trump's sentence will be?
I don't think it will impact Judge Merchan's decision. I think he's going to be a neutral judge. I don't think he's going to bring in his personal views on Donald Trump into the sentencing. And as we know there is going to be a sentencing report, and it's going to examine the nature of the crime, his history, has he had any contact with the criminal justice system. It's also going to talk to Donald about, the person who interviews him is going to discuss how sorry is he? Does he admit that the jurors got it right? Is he still being belligerent? All of that is going to be taken into account when the judge is deciding a sentence. But I don't think the judge is going to take it personal and have a, vengeance against Donald Trump for treating him badly and not abiding to his gag orders and attacking the judge's family. The judge is going to do what's right and follow the law. And I don't think Donald Trump is going to prison for this. I think there will be an appeal, and I think it's not even going to impact his base. They're going to rally around him even more.
And once again, we're taking a live look outside the courthouse in Manhattan. You can see the cameras from the chopper zoomed in on the former president, Donald Trump, as he prepares to leave the courthouse. Marie, once again, there were 34 counts of falsifying business records in connection with allegedly concealing payments to his former attorney fixer, Michael Cohen. This was in connection to an alleged hush money scheme to silence adult film star Stormy Daniels. Marie, I know you said that you were surprised by this decision, but going back to the defense team, in your view, did they actually make a convincing case?
You know what? They didn't make a convincing case. Their case was just really wrapped around the fact that, why is this even a crime? They're weaponizing the law. If he weren't Donald Trump, this wouldn't be happening. Michael Cohen is a felon. Everyone is lying. They were all sycophants, just doing Donald Trump a favor, and he was never involved in any conspiracy to commit election fraud. They did what they could, but the law is the law, and the way they put it together, the jurors believed that he broke the law. But defense had nothing more to say except the main witness is a felon, someone who has a gripe to pick with Donald Trump. Nobody likes Donald, and this is just weaponizing the law against him. And the jurors didn't buy it. That's what happened here.
Marie Pereira, former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. Marie, thank you for your time and insight.
All right, let's bring in White House correspondent Haley Bull right now, who is live outside the White House. What reaction are you hearing, Haley, from the Biden campaign?
Well, Chris, we are hearing from the Biden campaign tonight. They are out with a statement through their communications director that really centers on what they view as a threat to democracy. They write, quote, Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. And this largely reflects the messaging we have heard on the campaign trail that is centered from the Biden campaign on what they view as the stakes of democracy. That statement goes on to accuse Trump of a, quote, unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution. That word unhinged, one we have heard President Biden bring from private remarks behind closed doors to the campaign rally stage this week as he focused on Trump's rhetoric on January 6th on policy. The communications director going on to say, quote, a second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November. The campaign setting up a juxtaposition of a picture of chaos they are trying to paint with the former president, with President Biden, as we have seen to date, focused on the job. Now, we have not heard from President Biden himself directly. He has spent the day in Delaware today, also marking the 9th anniversary of his son, Beau Biden's death. In the White House, not commenting on the official side tonight beyond the White House counsel's office spokesperson saying, quote, we respect the rule of law and have no additional comment. The White House has really veered away from commenting directly on Trump's legal troubles, really trying to underscore the message that Biden is on the job, and that is where his sole focus is, even as we have seen Biden ratchet up his criticism of Trump on the campaign campaign trail, but stopped short of directly commenting on his legal troubles. The question here is how much the campaign and how much the president himself leans into that term convicted felon going forward, Chris.
All right, Haley Bull, thank you for that live report. And now we're taking another live look from above as former President Donald Trump has left the courthouse in Manhattan following this historic announcement guilty on all 34 felony counts. We want to bring in now former New York State Judge and prosecutor Rich Giardino. Rich, for viewers who are just joining us, where do we go from here? What happens next?
So procedurally, what happens is the defense attorneys for President Trump will make a motion to set aside the verdict. It's a pro forma motion. They'll file papers. They'll get the transcript from the trial, and the DA will respond. The court will then review it prior to sentencing. Generally, the court will deny such a motion, and the court's rulings up until now indicate to me that he would deny a motion to set aside the verdict as not based on the facts of the law. Then he will be sentenced by the court. There will be, as your other guest had said, a pre-sentence investigation through probation. Again, as a judge, we look at the facts and circumstances, and we look at the past record or lack of record, in this case of President Trump. While there's prison sentences of a max of 1/3 to 4, this defendant, Mr. President Trump, has no prior criminal record. This is not something that normally one would think would end up in a prison sentence. This is something that if he does sentence him would probably be probation. It's interesting, the timing. The timing is before the convention, shortly before the convention. So from after the sentence, the president's lawyers will seek a stay of the imposition or the execution of the sentence, either by Judge Merchan or by an appellate court. Generally, appellate courts, in a case of this nature, it's a nonviolent felony. It's a very unusual case. There's a lot of appealable arguments and issues. I see that either the appellate court or the sentencing judge would issue the stay of execution of the sentence, and the president will be out to campaign while an appeal progresses. That's the legal procedural end. There's also the political side of this, and there's also the disappointment in the criminal justice system that's occurred.
How much room is there for Judge Merchan if he's upset about what former President Trump said about him to factor that into what he decides the sentence to be?
He's not supposed to take personal views or opinions and factor those in, but there's initially, even though it was only $35 donation, he donated to President Biden 4 years ago, and it's the appearance in New York of impropriety. Even if he is not corrupted by the $35 donation, he also donated to anti-Republican organizations. So for those reasons, he should have really stepped aside in the beginning and recused himself. So that's going to be an appealable issue. I think that he was intent on this case because it will be the biggest case of his career ever. He will not get another case of this nature with this publicity. And so I just hope that he plays it down the middle. So far, the rulings I saw and some of the issues raised, I don't think that he was being fair and impartial to Mr. Trump in this case.
Yeah, Rich, give us your take. I mean, how was the performance of the defense team? Obviously, we know the jury handed down this verdict, but just given what you've seen over the past few weeks, I'm just curious to get your take.
Well, here's what people have to understand. The defense has no burden whatsoever. I do think that the judge should not have precluded testimony about some of the things that Cohen had said to others, and he should have allowed an expert to testify about how the federal government viewed these same set of facts. That's very important, and you could argue that those are expert witnesses. So I think the defense team did what they should have done. I think that the prosecution overstepped the bounds. First of all, they used a tape-recorded conversation between Mr. Trump and Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen was his lawyer. So unless it's a new Mr. Cohen's tape should not have been allowed. It should have been confidential by attorney-client privilege, and only Mr. Trump can release that privilege. I already mentioned Judge Merchan's donation. I've had friends say, well, it's only $35. I don't care. It shows that he has a predisposition against Mr. Trump and for Mr. I think that the defense bar in the state of New York and the defense bar across the country kind of disappointed me. I thought that they should have been louder and spoke out more than a few defense attorneys and said, look, this is wrong. They know that no other defendant has been charged or would be charged under these theories where they take a misdemeanor and elevate it to a felony based on a federal charge. It's just a local prosecutor really should not have been involved in something like this. I think the age of the case when the incident allegedly occurred, and also when the paperwork was filed, it just reeks of politics. And I think from a political standpoint, Alvin Bragg succeeded in what he wanted to do. He tied up President Trump for 6 weeks, and he muddied him up so that now he is a convicted felon at this point, and it'll go up on appeal. I do think ultimately, whether it's the courts in New York or it goes up to the federal court from there, from the Court of Appeals, I think President Trump will have the case reversed, and they will not proceed further.
Rich Giardino, thank you so much for your take. We appreciate it as we break down what just happened over just about 50 minutes ago. That's it. It feels like it's been a lot longer than that. Let's get to Alex Miller, who was inside the courtroom when this verdict was read. Alex, what was the mood of the jury as this was happening?
Very somber as they walked in. They walked very lightly. They just very quietly took their seats. They were asked a couple questions to say in unison, is this your verdict? Do you have a verdict? And they all said it, but they said it quietly, not super emphatically. The foreman got up. He was handed a microphone, and he, I think a good indication of what was to come was that he had no papers in front of him. He was just saying guilty, 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 and there was nothing for him to try to have to memorize. And so as soon as I noticed that, I knew that this was going to start to unfold to be a completely guilty verdict because he didn't have to reference any specific counts. But again, yeah, they stayed pretty solemn. And they each, again, pretty quietly answered when they were asked individually if this was their verdict.
And Alex, we can hear some of the chants happening right now outside the courtroom. If you can't just, paint the scene for us.
Yeah, this street behind me is completely closed right now to anybody but the NYPD. There are police officers everywhere. We've had these barricades set up the entire trial, but there are more barricades set up. There are more police officers. They are lining the streets behind me, but there are also a bunch of them over my shoulder right here because just a couple of feet from me is Collect Pond Park, which is where they have been keeping essentially the protesters that have come out. There haven't been that many protesters here over the course of this trial, but this crowd has grown quite substantially over the last hour or so, I would say. People not necessarily coming out to protest one way or another, but I'm watching a lot of people come up, take pictures on their phone, just here to see what this moment really looks like. But I would say there is a substantial presence here that we have not seen, really, I would say, since Trump's arraignment back on April 4th in 2023. Helicopters above us, and certainly a lot of eyes all around us.
And Alex, we have about a minute. How would you characterize the security situation you're seeing outside the courthouse right now?
Heavy security here. I mean, there are officers everywhere paying attention. I've watched their heads be on a swivel for the most part, making sure that nobody can walk. I mean, even journalists who were just exiting the courtroom a little bit after I did all got stopped a couple of feet from me, weren't allowed to get to their positions because they were making sure that the former president was able to exit the courthouse safely. I mean, it is a big operation between Secret Service, court police here, the NYPD outside to make sure that everything moves smoothly as possible and to give him, the privacy that he might need.
All right, our national political.
And you have been watching Scripps News coverage of the verdict.